Hello and welcome to Sound Strategic. I'm Meia Nouwens. In today's episode, we'll be discussing U.S. politics and foreign policy, looking back to the last days of the Trump administration, but more importantly, looking forward to what we can expect from a Biden administration. Yesterday, former Vice President, now President Joe Biden was sworn in as the 46th President of the United States, inheriting a nation overwhelmed by the COVID crisis and divided by the last 4 years of Donald Trump's presidency, which culminated on January 6th with a deadly assault on the Capitol as Trump supporters attempted to stop Joe Biden's certification. Joining me today to discuss the challenges President Biden faces to his domestic and foreign agenda are Dr. Ben Rhode and Dr. Kori Schake. Dr. Rhode is the editor of the IISS's Adelphi series and senior fellow for Transatlantic Affairs, and focuses his research on the past, present, and future of transatlantic relations, as well as the changing nature of power and alliances in the 21st century. And Dr. Schake is the Director of Foreign Policy and Defense Policy at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI. Prior to joining AEI, Kori was the Deputy Director-General of the IISS. Kori has a distinguished career in government, working at the U.S. State Department, Department of Defense, and the National Security Council at the White House. And loyal listeners of our podcast might also remember her, undoubtedly, as the previous host of Sound Strategic. So this is not at all an intimidating episode to record. Ben, welcome. Kori, welcome back.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be among you, my friends.
It's mine. It's good to be here.
So finally, after two failed bids of the presidency in 1998 and 2008, Joe Biden took his oath of office wearing a face mask and with only a threadbare crowd to witness his swearing in. It is doubtful that back in 1998, he would have imagined he'd end up succeeding Donald Trump as president, but it's reckoning with the divisive and norm-breaking legacy of the 45th president that will be one of the key challenges to Biden's term in office. So in just a few sentences, Kori and Ben, how significant a moment did you feel it was when Biden was sworn in, especially in the context of recent weeks with the threats of violence and insurrection? Maybe Ben first.
I think obviously there was a huge amount of symbolism that was picked up by the participants in the inauguration ceremony. But this was taking place 2 weeks on the same location as the violent mob / insurrection that was incited by former President Donald Trump. And I think it was very important to reject that, both in rhetoric but also in performance, in the sense that the inauguration was a self-conscious and I think quite successful attempt to project the importance of unity. President Biden made very clear, he talked about these 6 crises the United States was facing simultaneously. Any one of them would be bad enough, but they were all at once. And, one of these, he said, there's an attack on our democracy and on truth. And he made very clear that we must reject the culture in which facts themselves are manipulated and even manufactured. And I think it's very important that he did that because, as we know, many of the people storming the Capitol 2 weeks ago seemed to be under the genuine impression that they were, stopping the steal, that the election had been stolen, that this was illegitimate, that there was this terrible deception going on, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, we know that wasn't true. But when people propagate lies, I think President Biden said for power and profit, it's very easy to see how this gets out of hand quite quickly.
Kori?
So I thought it was lovely. I'm honestly breathing more easily now that the inauguration has taken place. The Midwestern charm of Senator Klobuchar and Senator Blunt orchestrating the entire inauguration, the power of President Biden saying that we need to bring this uncivil war to an end, the majesty of Amanda Gorman, the young poet whose work closed out the session, and thank God that there was no violence. I mean, even the crazy fun of Lady Gaga, who did a fabulous rendition of the national anthem. It all felt so normal, and it all felt like the high baseline of anxiety that we have had during the Trump administration might actually be able to melt away as government becomes boring and competent again.
You mentioned the violence and the insurrection attempted on January 6th, Kori, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about the insurrection, considering we had such a positive and uplifting day yesterday, but I can't avoid it altogether either, of course. So will the events that we saw on January 6th have a long-lasting impact on domestic politics, do you think, in the United States, or is this a blip?
I think it will have a long-lasting effect, Meia, for a couple of reasons. First, because it marred the first transition of power in 153 years. It marred it with violence by a sitting president attempting to encourage a violent mob to prevent the announcement of electoral college votes, removing him from office. So yeah, I think it's going to cast a long shadow, and it should. The second reason I think it's significant in American politics is that, the president had for years tried to prevent the FBI and other law enforcement agencies from taking seriously the rise of right-wing violence. In 2010, the Center of Terrorism, Counterterrorism Center is what it's actually called, at West Point, put out a study raising concern about the rise of right-wing violence, and they were castigated for it, but they were early on to the problem. One of the things that's so interesting is that the FBI assiduously going after people in that violent mob on January 6th. They received over 200,000 tips from Americans about people they recognized, florist shop owners, to be able to hold them accountable for what they did. And I think it did deter violence, not only on Inauguration Day, but the calls for marches against state capitals fizzled out as well. So it's a reminder that assiduous rule of law in the United States returning is also going to be important for tamping down on these kinds of things.
Ben, if you don't have anything to add, I might ask a follow-up question, which is really about who this group represents that participated in the insurrection. What portion of society do they represent? Are they a fringe, or are they much more substantial than just a fringe? And also, what led to its influence of groups? What led to the influence of groups like QAnon and the Proud Boys within this movement?
The violent mob that stormed the Capitol on January 6th is probably not representative of the entirety of President Trump's supporters. There are people who could afford to buy plane tickets or bus tickets and take time off work and come to Washington. And so it's a specific slice of the president's supporters, but they do have one commonality with the larger group of the president's supporters, which is that they're being radicalized online. And I think we are in the midst of figuring out how social media is affecting our politics. We're about to see, I think, in the new Congress, much more assertive calls and legislation to regulate social media, because they are doing damage to democracy in America by allowing falsehoods to be instantaneously propagated to millions of people. And the scholarship on the subject shows that even when you clarify and force retractions of lies, they still, even the clarifications and that bring accountability, still foster propagation of the lies. So we got to figure our way through this. And it's not just, de-radicalization of the violent right in the United States through law enforcement and better information, but it's also getting a handle on social media.
So just echoing what Kori is saying, I think it's very important that we don't make blanket judgments about the people who were there. But I think she's right that we have to be very aware of this online radicalization. So QAnon, for instance, is essentially a cult. It's like many cults or paranoid movements before it. It has a revealed truth of a terrible conspiratorial movement to do evil and to control the world. Essentially, a vast global network of sinister elites engaging in satanic worship and terrible kind of cannibalism and pedophilia. It borrows a lot from various kind of anti-Semitic myths, like the blood libel. There's this whole thing about how all the Hollywood elites are drinking children's blood to stay young, looking young. I mean, it sounds crazy, but a lot of people seem to genuinely subscribe to this. And what's interesting is we're seeing this kind of cult develop in real time. And I'm sure that the pandemic has had a kind of catalytic effect on this. As we look back at history, we look at similar kind of millenarian, conspiratorial, paranoid movements. They do tend to get, a stimulus whenever there's some kind of economic or cataclysm or plague or something like that. And I think a lot of people are stuck indoors without much to do other than trying to have some human connection with others on social media. Whereas Kori says, lies and falsehoods and fabulations fly around at the speed of light. And, there's a horrifying reality that a significant proportion of people in our societies now get most of their information from social media. And social media is essentially an engine that is designed to provide you with more and more extreme versions of the content you've previously shown an interest in. So it is not, a newspaper which feels it has some kind of duty to the truth or to balance. It just gives you more stuff that will keep on lighting your kind of the lights in your brain and get you spending more and more time on this network. And I've heard someone whose name now escapes me, saying essentially it's like every time you went onto Wikipedia, you saw a completely separate website from everyone else. You just saw what was tailored to basically stimulate your prejudices and keep you coming back for more. And when we don't have a kind of central source of authoritative news, then we lose, we lose this idea of objective truth. And former President Obama has been very open about this. He said, we really, our democracy is under threat if we cannot get a hold on this. I don't know. I mean, Kori, I hope that Kori is right that the new Congress will essentially start clamping down on social media that is essentially, publishers, but pretends to be a kind of bulletin board in the public square, and they don't have any responsibility, just other people putting stuff up there. I hope that's the case. I fear that it might not be quite as straightforward as that, but we'll see.
I mean, taking the regulatory route of addressing problems around social media and information online, these seem like medium-term goals to achieve it, and we'll have processes that need to be done. But what else can President Biden do in the shorter, more immediate term to end, as he said, this uncivil war?
Well, I don't think we should actually put responsibility for ending the uncivil war on the newly elected president, since it's actually my fellow Republicans who call the legitimacy of our elections into question. And President Trump, prominently is a political arsonist, but he's by no means the only one. And so we Republicans have principal responsibility for bringing an end to the uncivil war. But I also think, barring competent government will go a fair distance towards removing the fuel of the fire. And Ben said something that I hadn't thought about before, which is, it's probably not inconsequential that the worst of this is going on during a pandemic where people are, trapped at home, their normal social interactions aren't occurring. So that's probably feeding the fire as well. But most importantly, rebuilding a sense of community. My AEI colleague, Yuval Levin, has done wonderful work on this about the way that you restore commitment and constitutional governance in the United States is by, the building blocks of local community. So to some extent, you can force it down from the top, as we have seen with the FBI identifying, arresting, and issuing federal charges against the insurrectionists from January 6th. But I think Yuval's point is a really powerful one, that the place where we have the strongest commonality is in our communities, and building up from that is an important way. The question of de-radicalization, I think, is really important because all of us have family members who, are virulent Trumpists, and for the last 4 years have been turning keys in the lock, trying to find ways of common ground. And I, at least, really struggle to do that with the people in my extended circle who are Trump supporters. So I'm not quite sure, but there's a lot of good scholarship about de-radicalization and off-ramps that I think all of us need to be exploring if we're going to get a handle not on the small proportion of people who were violent insurrectionists, but the much larger group of people who continue to support President Trump even after 4 years of seeing what he was doing to the country.
I was just going to say, I think Kori is raising a really interesting issue here, and it's in some ways it's fascinating that we've been talking about de-radicalization for 20 years in the Islamist terror context. And, there's been a lot of work done of how do you get predominantly these young men, usually in their 20s and 30s, often who, again, are radicalized online and find some sense of community and meaning in this narrative of you are a warrior in a cosmic war, and suddenly your life is very significant and everything can be explained by this narrative. And how you de-radicalize those ones, at least the ones who are still alive. But then there is this larger issue of how do you de-radicalize very large numbers of people who give that kind of emotional and intellectual cover to the kind of much smaller, actively violent subset of that group. And I don't know, I wish I knew more. I should know more about how does one go about that? How does one, and this is a question I'd like to talk to you both about, is how does one actually, what are the precedents for this? We can think of, how were the Germans, quote, de-radicalized after 1945? How were the Japanese, quote, de-radicalized after 1945? I worry that the answers to that are maybe not applicable to what we're talking about here. But anyway, it's an open question.
Lessons will be learned, I'm sure, but then again, that social media connectivity question comes into play. It's not exactly the same. I don't, Kori, do you have a comment?
So I think there are precedents because while social media is a unique phenomenon, I seem to recall that when radio became freely available, Father Coughlin and the mobilization of intolerance in the 1930s, or when television became a way of propagating. So we do have precedents. My guess is if we look at when literacy became the general state of the public, and you begin to have the wildness of American newspapers in the early 19th century, or even the late 18th century, they were radicalizing force too. And I don't know the answer to that, but it seems to me scholars must know the answer to that. So looking at the priors of when you have an expansion of media availability and what defangs it eventually, because something does in those prior cases. I just don't know what the answer is yet.
I think lots of questions for further research on this one than the three of us could answer. But maybe moving on to the Republican Party. Kori, I have a particular question for you. A number of members of the Republican Party have been willing to align themselves or have even supported groups like QAnon, the vast minority, of course. But I was just wondering what these groups in particular have meant for the health and the state of the Republican Party as it now stands. Is there soul searching going on?
I think that's too soon to tell. An important indicator will be how Republican senators vote on President Trump's impeachment. That seems to me, the Senate is supposed to be the saucer that cools the tea of the House, because the House of Representatives have smaller constituencies, and because of the nature of American politics, that is how we select our party candidates and also how we draw our congressional districts. Members of the House of Representatives tend to have smaller, more cohesive constituencies. And so you see, for example, Wyoming Republicans outraged with Congresswoman Cheney, who made such an principled appeal to the impeachment in the House of Donald Trump. I think, her fate is going to be important. How senators vote on this are going to be important. How businesses that provide so much funding vote on it. I thought it was really heartening after the insurrection on January 6th that so many American businesses refused to provide any future financial support to those candidates who whipped up the mob to attack the Capitol. Senator Hawley had hotels refuse to host his events. And money's an important proxy in American politics. It doesn't determine electoral outcomes, but it is important for signaling broader public moods. And that's what's always significant in American politics, because elections are tied so tightly to public attitudes in the United States that I think those are going to be really important indicators. I must say, though, that it's terrible that Republicans have allowed this to go as far as it has in their support of Trump and in their endorsement of this lunatic fringe that Ben was describing.
Ben, can I maybe ask what you think about the importance of Trump being impeached? Is this something that will harm or help build unity in the immediate post-Trump era?
You can argue it either way. The people who would argue against impeachment would say, listen, we need to heal. This is not the moment for more division. This is not the moment for some kind of gladiatorial spectacle with former President Trump being put on trial and we need to move forward, et cetera, et cetera. I understand that urge, and I can imagine that President Biden does not relish the idea that his first 100 days will inevitably be somewhat overshadowed by this experience. I obviously, as you can hear from the tone of my voice, fall down somewhat on the other side, which is actually, yes, unity is vital. And President Biden was completely right to say that unity is important and that there do have to be efforts made, not just by the Republicans, but also by the Democrats to reach out and to kind of bind the wounds together. But my view is that also requires accountability. And I don't think that it promotes national healing by allowing a politician to incite violence that killed, I think, 5 or 6 people and say, well, let's let him get away with it because it would be very uncomfortable to try to hold him to account. My guess is that a number of Republican senators will vote to convict him, but I assume it's not going to be 17 of them. I could be wrong, and I'd be interested if Kori disagrees with me on that. My guess is, we might get 5, maybe nudging up towards 10, but I don't think it's going to be 17 that will be required to convict him in the Senate. More's the pity.
So Moving on to maybe foreign policy implications of all of this, I don't only want to talk about domestic politics, as important as that is, but following on from all of this, what effects is Trump's legacy, in particular the last few weeks he was in office, on the US's foreign affairs at the moment? And I'm thinking here in particular how Biden will use his first 100 days to kind of signal the prioritization in his domestic versus foreign policies.
My sense is that President Trump's disgraceful behavior since the election will even further discredit democracy in America, right? Because America's allies aren't just gonna breathe a sigh of relief that American voters didn't reelect Donald Trump. They're also legitimately going to fear how much support he continues to have and the risk that a Trump-like candidate, a candidate who has Trump's views, could get elected in future elections. So I think there'll be some bet hedging, as I think we saw with the EU proceeding with its trade agreement with China. And I think there will be lots of efforts by the Biden administration to show that they're calm and reliable and that the regression to the mean can hold. I would say, though, that there's one easy way to prevent the seesawing of American foreign policy on issues like the JCPOA, which is to do what American presidents should always do, which is submit foreign agreements to the approval of the Congress. Doing things by executive order is, that makes the system more fragile. The American system is designed to be able to do nothing without widespread approval. There's no substitute for winning the argument. And that means getting the majority of Congress to go along with what the president wants to do on foreign policy. And thankfully, I think Joe Biden's inclination is that direction as well.
And if I could ask you a question on transatlantic relations that Biden is inheriting, we know that Biden seeks to rebuild trust with allies and repair the transatlantic relationship, or at least close in some of the gaps that Trump had made. But has the European side of the transatlantic relationship moved on since Obama left office and since former President Trump took office? And I'm thinking here perhaps of the Franco-German-British relationship in an era of post-Brexit, of post-Merkel. What does the European side do from now on? Does it simply return to business as usual, or does it, as Kori said, in certain ways continue to think it needs to hedge against the US?
I think it's a very interesting question, Meia. And I think, obviously in some ways the new Biden administration is a restoration government. If you just look at not just the fact that President Biden himself was President Obama's vice president, but just the personnel at the top level, there's a very high overlap with Obama's administrations. And I think that a lot of Europeans will look at this and they'll look at, the priorities that President Biden has laid forward, not least, taking climate security seriously. And they'll think, thank God we've been delivered. This is, we couldn't have hoped for any more. This is what we were hoping would happen for the past 4 years. And that now we can return to this kind of status quo ante. But I think you're right to point out that there has been this split within Europe about thinking, well, actually, what does Trump represent? Does he represent an aberration and we just kind of hold our breath for 4 years and hope that, we can last, and at the end of 4 years, we can breathe again and we can go back to where we were? Or does he actually represent a broader truth, which is the United States, for instance, isn't going to tolerate paying for Europe's defense if the Europeans can't be bothered to pay for it themselves? And so you, for instance, see this split most obviously between, say, President Macron in France versus Chancellor Merkel and various people in the kind of strategic community in Germany who might say, no, look, just hold on and we'll, we don't need to do anything drastic about this. But I think there is a growing awareness that actually, as Kori has pointed out, the past few weeks have highlighted that, there are quite primeval passions within American politics, and that another president in 4 years might be in power, who, while he may not be President, or she may not be President Trump, might have broadly Trumpist inclinations towards foreign partners and allies. And I suppose the irony is that, you know, over the past few years, people like President Macron have been talking about the need for strategic autonomy and some kind of strategic independence from the United States. And the IISS has been leading the way in showing how much might this actually cost, how much might European states need to pay to make up gaps in American military capability in Europe. And right now, I suspect the appetite for spending hundreds of billions of euros might be somewhat lower, given that we've all had to take on vast amounts of debt to pay for the COVID calamity.
Can I add just one point to Ben's excellent explanation, which is that it's not just that strategic autonomy is expensive, it's also that the world can be really scary. And a predatory China that begins to make Europeans nervous, it might actually want the United States involved on their side of the argument. And so the banding together of free societies to solve problems, whether it's strategic depth on global health issues or climate change, you know, it's not just that strategic autonomy is expensive, it's also that it's lonely in lots of ways.
Absolutely. I actually think that China knows what feeling lonely actually feels like, not having any allies in its court. I have a lot more questions for both of you, and I'm sure we could talk for a lot longer on this topic. But I'm afraid this is all the time that we have for today. So I wanted to thank you both for your insightful and optimistic in some ways conversation. And I hope to have you both on the podcast again soon.
What a joy to be back in the company of my IISS fellows. And thank you for your leadership, Meia.
Thank you, Meia. I really enjoyed being back on the podcast, and it was great to speak with Kori again.
And we hope you enjoyed the episode as well. Don't forget to rate and subscribe to Sound Strategic wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Thank you, and see you next time.